Hello, welcome everybody to the second episode, you could say, of our webinar about studying music overseas. Today, I am very, very excited to have two special participants, I guess, because one will be a moderator and the other as our guest speaker. But what's really exciting for me is that this is a mini reunion of sorts because we all three went to Harvard together and we're in the same class. So first off, I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Miss Winsome Brown. Winsome is a writer, director, and an Obie Award-winning actor whose work has received critical acclaim in the New York Times, Scotsman, Variety, and many others. She's known for creating powerful solo works for theater, including Hit the Body Alarm, which paired Paradise Lost with music from John Zorn, and with two contemporary jail tales. And this is Mary Brown, which debuted at La Mama and the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in 2015. Now, Winsome has participated in long-term theater and film projects with directors such as Andre Gregory and Irina Brooke, and is featured in the upcoming film with Tom Hanks, News of the World. Her film, The Violinist, took her deep into the life and pressures of an early 20th century violinist, virtuoso, and perhaps that makes her an even more appropriate moderator for today. She has been a champion of classical music for a long time now and served on the board of the International Contemporary Ensemble for 5 years. So from New York City, let me hand it over to Winsome.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Trey. Good morning, Trey. Good morning, David. And good morning to all the panelists and participants in your various homes. Good evening to you, because it's morning here for us, but I think it's evening for most of you. It's my great pleasure to be here. As Maria says in the great film, The Sound of Music, let's start at the very beginning. We're here to talk about music and music education. So why don't I'd love to hear about your introduction to music and your early music education. David, let's start with you.
Excuse me. Good morning, Trey. Good morning, Winsome. Hello, all the audience. Good evening to you. My education was like the experience of many Asian American musicians of my generation. Came from a non-musical family. Thought it would be a very good thing for their son or daughter to do at an early age. So I was 3.5 in a Montessori preschool, and a Suzuki teacher came with 2 students for demonstration. And I think most of our audience is in Hong Kong, so you'll relate right away when the presentation mentioned that children who study music seem to do better in reading and math. My parents were sold. It's like, here we go. It's like keys to a better education through music. And they never had any vision that it would turn into this. So, I had like a very normal beginning in terms of studying. It was like something that my parents stumbled upon. They thought, oh, this would be really good for a child. And then it took on a life of its own.
How about you, Trey?
Well, I think, first of all, I think a lot of the audience in Hong Kong will already know a bit about my background, but in fact, I did come from a sort of musical family because my mom was a pianist, and both my older sisters played an instrument, a piano and violin, and so eventually when I got to the cello, we had a family trio. And so that was sort of expected almost of me to take up an instrument because everyone else at home had one and was practicing on it. Even though I was not a big fan of it. I have to admit, I really did not enjoy practicing or, doing all the hard work.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of the young students can relate.
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the questions we get so often as musicians is how do we get our children to practice, or how do we get them to at least to, bear practicing, if not enjoy practicing. And there is no magic bullet for that, is there? It is hard work, and eventually I even made a deal with my mom saying that, okay, I will finish when I graduate from high school. I will do it until high school is done, and then I will do whatever I want. I don't know about David. What was your situation?
Yeah, exactly the same. It was, I, I progressed very quickly. So I outgrew my Suzuki teacher within 2, 3 years. And then, so my parents, they didn't know a lot about music, but they knew that something special was happening. So they asked around, and this new Russian teacher had just arrived in town. And, he was straight from the Soviet school. So it went from like, you know, for those of you who did Suzuki method, I was a 6-year old in Suzuki Book 8. I mean, that's progressing pretty quickly. But then to go to somebody from the Soviet school and be practicing scales and octaves like within a year is like, that's pretty hardcore. So it became a lot less fun very quickly. Like up to that point, I was enjoying going to group class and playing the Bach double, and I was like the 6-year-old in the violin one group with 14-year-olds, and that was pretty cool. And all of a sudden, it was like the whip was being cracked, and it was no fun. And by age 10 or 11, I said I want to stop. And my parents had this message for me that, okay, we understand where you're coming from. We can go easy. Like we never wanted you to be a musician anyway. This is just we're all kind of learning as this goes along. So by all means, take it easy, but just don't quit. Please don't quit, because a lot of people, when they get to our age, they have a lot of regrets. And one is, Mom and Dad, I wish you had me continue with XYZ because I regret now having let it go. So just promise us you won't quit. Like, fine, I'll keep on going till I get to college. And then the day I graduate, I am out of this door. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. When I had a turning point after my freshman year of high school. I went on tour with the San Diego Youth Symphony. I was not a member, but I was playing a concerto solo with them. And in effect, for that tour, I was a member because I played in the orchestra for the second half for fun, and traveling Eastern Europe for 3 weeks with my peers. It just changed everything for me. And I came home and I said, Mom and Dad, I'm going to be a musician when I grow up. And they're like, stop. It was too late. Somebody had flipped the switch, and it was never the same after that.
David, what age were you when that switch got flipped?
I guess after freshman year, I guess I had just turned 15.
15, okay, so full-on teenager. Trey, can you tell us a little bit about your conservatory experience?
Well, the thing was, I think, David and I, well, and you also, we all went to Harvard where there was no music major, at least for performances. They had music theory and music history and so on. So I think we all went there knowing that we were not going to be getting a conservatory education, but rather a liberal arts education. And that was exactly what I wanted, because I thought, okay, I don't want to go into music. I was still in the mindset that I did not want to go into that field. I had seen at Juilliard, when I was at Juilliard pre-college in New York, all the college students and how, everyone's just locked up in a practice room all day. And I thought, oh my God, I don't want to do that myself. I think that I would not survive that. And so when I got to Harvard, actually, I was like, what is the farthest thing away from music possible? So I did economics, and which was sort of the default, as I think we all know, for a lot of students who didn't know what they wanted to do in the future. It sounded like a useful concentration. And so I did that, and I also dabbled in summer internships on Wall Street. And after graduation, I also did a year of management consulting. But while at Harvard, I have to say, that was a really important musical moment for me, because that was the first time I met other people my age who liked to listen to classical music and who appreciated it and were, who actually appreciated what I used to do. So that for me, that was really eye-opening. In a way, I'm quite envious that David got his moments so much earlier in high school. Whereas for me, it came, I guess, sort of towards the end of Harvard.
Fascinating. I'm amazed that it was at Harvard that you met other people who loved to listen to classical music and not at the Juilliard pre-college.
Well, yeah, I don't know. David, you're teaching at Juilliard, so maybe you could enlighten us a bit on what the parents are like.
I think more accurately, I'm a Juilliard pre-college parent now. I have a daughter at Juilliard pre-college, and she's not fighting us to be there, but she's also not it's not like her wish to be there. So I think that's the thing is you have a lot of Juilliard pre-college kids who are very, very talented, but they're not necessarily there of their own motivation. Actually, the former director of, it's not quite the right title, but the former VP of Juilliard pre-college, Robert Ross, who's now at the Tianjin Juilliard in China, he lived in my town in New Jersey, and he told me once that the Juilliard pre-college kids, they're all going to Ivy League schools. Like a very small percentage of them are actually staying for Juilliard College, despite the perception. The vast majority of them are going on to be very successful in other fields besides music. So that's something that's maybe not realized by everybody. But it was really interesting for me to hear Trey's path through Harvard, because I did discover before college that I wanted to be a musician. And I think my decision to go to Harvard rather than a conservatory was in part I keep referring to my first generation Asian immigrant parents who were kind of still fixated on a doctor, lawyer career for their firstborn son. And they were supportive of my career choice, but they wanted to make sure I had a solid enough general education before going to pursue a life in music. And the other part was me probably deep down knowing they had a good point there. I went to visit conservatories as well as colleges, and just on these college visits, they're only skin deep, of course, but you do get a feeling, and if you have like a kind of negative reaction to a place, it's not a really good sign for going there for 4 years. And my first reaction when I was in Cambridge was, I love this place. And my first impression when I was at Juilliard, I mean, the building then was a lot less attractive than now. And it was kind of dark, and you could still smoke in the hallways, and it was it did not leave a positive impression. I can say, having lived through Juilliard as a potential student, later as a master's student, now as a faculty member, in terms of like the external presentation, has come a long, long way. But I would just say that in retrospect, I spent so much of my life just engrossed in music in so many different facets and aspects. To have those 4 years of my life where music was really, really important to me, but I was constantly in contact with other people who were not in music, to have my mind expanded by areas that were not explicitly in music, was so valuable. Which is why now when I get calls from parents or from students who are considering university versus conservatory, and I always tell them, I said, conservatory is right for some people. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that if you can handle the rigors of practicing, knowing what you need to do if it's really the career you want to pursue, if you can handle that while handling the academics of a university education, absolutely do it, because you will not regret that.
That's a really wonderful way to finish this section. I'd like to talk a little bit about your life after university and how you went about getting into music professionally. I know, David, you mentioned Trey's interesting story. Trey, I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about your path.
Yeah, so like I said, I mean, I dabbled in music while I was at Harvard, but for the most part, I just thought I was always going to work in another field. And so I tried out the internships on Wall Street in the summers in college, and then management consulting afterwards. But all the while, you know, this idea of music as a possible life started to develop while I was finishing up Harvard. And you know, I was kind of lucky in a way, because I spoke to the teacher at New England Conservatory, Lawrence Lesser, who was also a Harvard graduate and majored in math. So he was very receptive to my change of part and to what I was struggling with about what to do with my life. And so I went and got my master's with him, and then after that, he said, go to Europe. I won't let you, I don't want you to stay here anymore. I wanted to keep studying with him, but he's like, no, just go to Europe. So he sort of kicked me out and said, okay, bye. And that was actually one of the best advice I ever got. And I've stayed in Europe ever since. Although, of course, now, you know, as all musicians are, we are not just in one place most of the time, or most performing arts fields, right? We're always traveling. But I feel like when I came to Europe, I definitely got a whole other perspective, which is because, you know, in Europe, the young people here have to choose their majors much earlier than in the States. And, you know, that's one of the luxuries, I guess, we have in the US, and where you can decide later, once you are at university, what you want to study. Whereas in Europe, a lot of these young musicians, they already committed to becoming professional in their teens, in their mid-teens. So that was actually quite interesting for me, because in a way you would say, okay, well, that's not necessarily a good thing, because how do you know when you're 15 that you want to be for sure a doctor or a musician or whatever? But at the same time, in music, I feel like it does attract those who are genuinely dedicated and passionate about it a lot of times. It doesn't mean they all eventually continue to be musicians, but for the most part, because they had to choose early and without sort of this, you know, what David was saying before, the immigrant parent mentality of a lot of students in the US and also in Asia, I think, you know, that the kid must do something safe or whatever. A lot of times in Europe, I found that the children just choose what they wanted to do, and the parents said, okay, that's fine. So if you're going to choose as a 15-year-old the life of a musician, I think by then you already pretty much have to love it. And I found I had a lot of colleagues here who were like that, and you know, it's quite different. But then, of course, at the same time, they asked me about how we did it in the States, and having gone to Harvard and then become a musician, which is also not a normal path. They also thought that was very interesting, because like what David was saying, you get to meet so many people from so many different fields and diverse backgrounds. I remember, you know, maybe you guys also remember this freshman year at Harvard. You know, you get there and you're like, is everybody here really good at something? Or, you know, what's their secret thing that they're really good at? And it was true. For the most part, I found a lot of my friends, they were really good at something that I had absolutely no competence in whatsoever. And that was just refreshing and mind-blowing and so rewarding.
Well, speaking of freshman year, if you don't mind me jumping in with some, is I mean, you remember expository writing?
Oh gosh.
Yes.
So, so I'll get to that in a second. I mean, I think for me, a really big thing is I agree with so much of what Trey is saying. I mean, things I thought of as I went to Sweden once and I met Andreas Larsson, who is a very famous sommelier, Swedish, worked in Paris, many big Michelin three-star restaurants. And he's a huge guy, looks like a hockey player, but he has no interest in athletics whatsoever. Like hockey, I mean, which is like Swedish national pastime, right? But he said that from a very early age, you're directed in Sweden either towards athletics or towards artistic things. And he was always drawn to the artistic things. So even though he had the physicality to be a hockey player, he was drawn into music and art and food and wine, and that he pursued that track. Another thing Trey said that triggered something is I always tell people don't do music unless you truly love it. I find that a lot of people, they're talented enough that their talent in music gives them a hall pass to something. It's like, oh, okay, you can be like mediocre at the schoolwork because you're so good at whatever instrument you play. Um, and they work just hard enough, they're just talented enough that they always get to the next level, and to the point where they're not really cultivating other skills. And if you think about it, how competitive the music profession is, they have to be pretty darn good and to have worked pretty hard compared to the general population in order to get to that point where they can even fall into an orchestra job in the US or anywhere. But they don't truly love it. They were never number one in talent or number one in hard work or number one in love. They were like number two all across the board. It was enough to get them into a profession. But then they find when you're rehearsing 4 hours a day and performing 4 hours a day, 320 days a year, that they don't love it enough to sustain that. And that's why you read articles about job satisfaction in US orchestras, and it comes out really low, like even lower than toll booth worker at times. And while you can be skeptical about how accurate that data really is, you see what I'm getting at is you shouldn't pursue it unless you truly love it, because to do it 8 hours a day for most days of the year, if you don't love it, that's going to wear on you, because it is truly challenging. And so now I'm finally getting to what I really want to say is there are great, amazing talents, and we see them in the music world. There are probably 4 or 5 of them in every generation across all the different instruments who, if you look at their lives, lead that like 100 years ago sheltered music prodigy sort of existence where they never really excelled at anything else. Like their parents sheltered them from everything else, raised them in a cocoon where it was just everything was fawning on their musical talent, and they've not grown up to live fully functional adult lives. They have like an entourage of people taking care of their every need outside of making their music. And these people are such musical geniuses that despite having lived this sheltered existence, their art expresses like this incredible, deep, profound humanity. Well, there are like 3 of them in every 50 years. For everyone else, everything else you learn and experience, life experience, heartbreak, bad decisions, and yes, going to school and learning about many other things besides music, everything we do factors into what you have to say as a musician somehow. And I refer to expository writing freshman year because I was a terrible writer. And I struggled through that class. And now, as an artistic director, as a music director, especially now during coronavirus, I have to do so much writing, and in order to make my music, in order to write proposals to people, in order to write a blurb for a season brochure. I mean, it goes on and on. It's like I thought this skill will never have any use in my musical career, and I'm leaning on it all the time. So you just don't know. Get that general education. It can't hurt you.
David, I wanted to follow up with something you said. You were talking really about the path of a musician that's leading to one of those few and far between professional orchestra jobs. But I think there are many other people out there who study music for different reasons, or music will end up serving a different purpose in their life long term. Not everyone will go on to become a professional professional musician. Trey, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just generally the music education that might go on to benefit a life that is not the life of a professional musician.
Well, actually, to begin with, I'd like to just address what you were both talking about now, which is that I think even though while we were at Harvard, we were not studying music performance, the skills that we got, whether from expository writing, which was also quite tough for me, but also the extracurriculars at Harvard, where so much of it you have to be, you have to initiate things, or you have to take part in activities that are not structured, and you have to create things. In theater also, I mean, Winsome, I'm sure you know all about that, but just that kind of surrounding, I feel like was a really great training for what we're doing now as artists, because besides being in a great orchestra like David is, he's also doing other activities. And I feel like, myself also, I've initiated all sorts of different activities and festivals, and I think that I don't know how much our education at Harvard helped us to do that, but I feel like it at least gave us some tools and experience or even the courage, let's say, to try things, to break the mold, out of the mold, and create new initiatives and new activities in our professions, which in a way is kind of how the music world works. It can't just survive on regulated structures. Yes, we have those, but it needs constant reinvention. It needs, fresh ideas. And I'm not sure, well, actually, I think a liberal arts education really helps in that direction. They talk about music helping the STEM fields, arts helping people in the STEM fields, right? Because it's activating another part of your brain. It also helps you to look at things from a different perspective, which is so important if you're in a field of creativity and innovation, because that's all about thinking outside of the box. And with music, especially I think classical music, where we are constantly having to reinterpret, reinvent old music. We can't play it exactly the same every time, or exactly the same as our teachers played it. We have to constantly come up with our own interpretation. And so I think this is something that a lot of people, whether you're professional or just amateur music lovers, they can benefit greatly from it, because it trains you, it forces you really to look at things, think about things differently. And that's, the older we get, right? The more we have to do this. And, they're also talking about how music is perhaps warding off Alzheimer's and dementia and things like that. It's all about keeping our brains really, really hyperactive in a way.
That's right. I think that's right. Maybe philosophically, you could talk just a little bit more, Trey, about what music does for the soul, what it does for your soul. I mean, regardless of what job anyone ends up having or what their life ends up being, how can a grounding in music education serve those people?
Oh, wow. I mean, I think everybody knows or have experienced sort of all the really positive effects of music, whether it's at memorial services or some kind of national tragedy. There's always needs to be music there, right? To console, to heal. But also for positive, happy moments, there's always music involved. And but I guess from a personal view, I think last week I don't know why I keep getting these messages from friends who are suffering from illnesses, but this week now a friend of mine, she was in the hospital and almost died from a blood clot, and everyone's been sending her condolences and emails and presents and stuff. I thought, well, what am I going to do? So today I recorded a short little thing to send to her so she can listen to it in her hospital bed. And just even a little gesture like that, I just feel like, why not? This is actually why we're doing this. So I think this is something, whether you pursue it as a professional or as an amateur, you're going to find uses, really concrete uses for music in your life in the most positive ways.
I think that's absolutely right. I was going to ask, both of you spoke a little bit about your early music education and then Harvard. Did either of you have continuing music education, further studies after you graduated from university, or do you study now? What is the practice and education of an adult musician?
Should I go?
Yes, David, thanks.
Okay. Well, after Harvard, I did pursue my master's at Juilliard. I'll say I did my master's, just so it's clear that I finished. But, so that even though I was studying seriously while at Harvard, not at Harvard, but while at Harvard, I felt I needed to do that to kind of immerse myself fully. And the interesting thing is teaching students who are an undergrad and graduate, and sometimes I continue to teach students privately who have graduated for a little while. My goal in teaching them is for them to be teaching themselves. I'm trying to leave them, that's kind of why I'm so desperate for them to get the tools I'm trying to give them while they're still in school, because the ones who are still relying on me to feed it to them are missing the point that at some point you have to teach yourself. And it isn't that you need you stop being a student. I'm a really big believer in the student for life sort of mentality, but that has to be in attitude rather than actuality. I mean, in actuality, there's a lot of obstacles to actually continuing to be a student. It doesn't mean that you can't occasionally play for someone, but to be actually continuing to be a student while you're trying to start a profession in it, that reads kind of funny to some people. There's a line where you have to unfortunately cross that boundary. But I found for myself what happened is you make the observation that you reach a level where no matter who you play for, you're being told the same thing, just in different words. You can play for 6 different people and they'll all tell you the same thing in different words. So it's really up to you whether you wake up and address that, or whether you want to join the ranks of those who think that if they play for someone else will tell you what you want to hear. So,
wow.
That, and also within 2 or 3, if you reach just an appropriate level, 2 or 3 lessons with somebody, you've probably got the bulk of what they're going to tell you. There's always going to be little things, but So gradually, if you can pick up on those cues more quickly, then you progress to the level of you start to learn from people who are more experienced than you. When I was a young professional playing chamber music with people who were much more experienced in the profession, that just like exploded my brain. It's like, wow, like these people, I thought I was their equal instrumentally, and I might have been on a physical level, but there were just so much experience and knowledge that was coming at me so fast. So it's a complicated answer to a relatively straightforward question, but the simple answer would be no, not exactly. But in reality, you have to continue learning. When I got into the Met Orchestra, then it was another version of that, and it never really ends.
That's a very helpful answer. I think that teaches us all and applies to not just musicians, but to all walks of life. I'd like to just finish up this first part before we go on to some of the audience questions. Just to, we've talked a little bit about the benefits of combining a liberal arts education and a musical education. I wonder, Trey, if you could just tell us a little bit how might the merits and the challenges of putting those two things together especially relate to foreign students in America?
I think there are definitely specific challenges and rewards if you're coming from outside of America, because so many education systems outside of America have what I was talking about before, like in Europe, this early track style of university studies where you decide before you go to university what your major is already. So I think, especially for students who are, perhaps still a bit lost about what they want to do with their lives, the US system, where David and I both were able to take advantage of the liberal arts education and still become professional musicians, that's definitely very helpful for, young people who are torn or unsure about what they want to do. And in addition to that, I think for example, a place like Harvard, the sort of very international student body, especially nowadays, I hear, is definitely another huge benefit, because of course with that comes perspectives and different ideas and opinions and things like that. So that's also, again, not necessarily something that's available everywhere else. I think the fact Harvard and other schools like Harvard recruit so actively for international students is definitely a big plus. The challenge is, I suppose, is, how do you balance, right? You're learning from such an early age how to balance and find your priorities about what's important. What, if I don't practice now, I have to admit, when I was at Harvard, I didn't practice really, and technically speaking, I suffered because of that and had to make up for it by practicing my butt off later. And but at the same time, I feel like I gained so much by dabbling, you could call it, in other fields. I enjoy history. I love history. I took a lot of history classes at Harvard. And today, it actually, I think it's quite helpful, those history classes, because, who knew I was going to live in Germany, and I took the, Europe from 1945 to 1989 history class, right? All about Germany. So, things like these, you can never predict, but at the same time, you just know it's going to be something that'll be good for you, I think.
That's wonderful. I'd like to turn to some of the questions from our audience and to thank you so much for this beginning discussion. We received some questions prior to our discussion this morning. So we'll start with those, and then if attendees have questions, you can put them in the Q&A and we'll see them, and we'll try and address all of your questions, but we'll start with the questions that we already pre-received. I think that, Trey, this one's for you because you're in Europe. An attendee asks, in comparison with the United Kingdom and Finland, what makes study in the US outstanding?
Outstanding. Well, I think the US university system is much more of an all-encompassing sort of life experience, because not only are you going to classes, you have so much more living on campus and all the activities, you know, we've briefly touched on before, outside of the classroom, right? And in the US, we're always talking about how in college, that's where you form your lifelong friendships and experiences, things like that. Whereas in Europe, like Finland, Germany, most of Europe, I'd say, people pretty much just go to their classes and then have their own social life outside of the university. Of course, they make friends there also, but it's not as conducive because, well, they don't spend as much resources into creating that kind of environment as in the US. So I would say you almost have to be more independent in Europe to go and make a life outside of your class. Whereas in the US, it's a bit easier because everything is there on the same campus. So definitely, I think that's a big advantage of the US system. Of course, you know, let's not go into costs because that's maybe the drawback now with the US versus European system. You know, you do get what you pay for, right? So in the US, you pay a lot, but you also get a lot, I think, in that sense.
If I could
Very
just
well.
if I could add to that very quickly, I practiced a lot my freshman year. My sophomore year, when we moved into houses, I discovered beer and pinball and chicken wings. And I spent a lot of time doing that. And the net result is that after my sophomore year, when I went to the Aspen Music Festival, people are like, "You improved so much this year." And I'm not going to say it's because of beer and pinball and chicken wings. All the practicing I did my freshman year probably finally percolated in. But I would say campus life and life experiences were a big part as well. So not to discount that.
Yes, that as musicians, as artists, we're expressing something. And in order to have something to express, we have to have something inside us. We need that life experience, except as you were saying, David, for those 2 or 3 exceptional superstars per generation who can just ingest music and bring out its soul without much life experience. What are the qualifications required for the music programs in the top US universities? I'll ask this one to you, David, as a teacher at Juilliard.
Well, so I mean, and I saw in the Q&A that there was a question about the double degree, so I can maybe address that at the same time. In the US, we have the standardized test called the SAT, and sometimes less often the ACT that students have to take to get into college. Now, for dedicated conservatory programs like Juilliard, for example, that's not required. A high school transcript and graduating and or high school equivalency is required. So you have these kind of competing demands, like for dedicated conservatory, it's more of an audition requirement and a high school diploma, whereas for university, it's high school diploma and standardized test scores, and maybe to a much lesser degree audition. Although if you go to Rice University, Shepherd School of Music, or Jacobs School of Music at Indiana, which are kind of 2 notable university programs very strong in music, you have to audition also. So here's kind of, you know, it's one thing to go to university that happens to have a music program. That's much more of your standard applying to college. Then you have the dedicated conservatory, which is a completely different path altogether. And then you have the few kind of in between, where you have a university program that's very strong in music, where they have an audition requirement on top of the standard school entrance requirements. So I would say the double degree, like Juilliard, Columbia, that exchange program, or NEC Harvard, New England Conservatory Harvard, are going to be even more rigorous than that because they realize that the attrition rate is really high if you're not really strong in both. So to get into Juilliard Columbia Exchange, you have to be kind of top 10 percentile audition wise and academically, because otherwise they know you won't be able to tread water in both. Does that help answer your question?
I think that's wonderful. Maybe Trey,
I
did you
think
have
that's
anything
actually
to add?
really interesting because the Juilliard, Columbia, and Harvard, New England Conservatory are actually quite unique, aren't they? These two programs, because they're two different schools as opposed to the Yale School of Music or Indiana Jacobs. They're part of the university. So in fact, it's difficult because also you have to satisfy two different schools' requirements.
Yeah.
And so you have to, if you're going to do that program, those programs would say, I guess you have to be extra dedicated because you got to satisfy these super tough academic schools and these super high level music schools at the same time. And that's quite unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess if you're going to be at Rice or at Indiana and pursue a second major while you're in the same school, that's or a minor even, I think that's one of the real advantages of going to a university or Oberlin, where you have access to other fields without having to go do a dual enrollment sort of thing. But yeah, there are many possibilities. It's just limited by your own kind of time and effort and resources.
Talking of resources, I'll jump topics here to another question, which is, could you please touch on the topic of gig culture in Europe and the USA during and after study? Trey, how about you for this one to begin?
Well, gig culture is certainly everywhere, I think, in the US and Europe. When I was still studying in Cologne in Germany, I joined this orchestra. It was kind of funny. I thought it was a youth orchestra, and it turned out to be professional, the Mahler Chamber Orchestra. And I thought, I'll just go for fun. And it turned out it was really, we played with Claudio Abbado at the Lucerne Festival. We played at the Proms in London. We played everywhere. And I got paid. I was expecting to be in this youth orchestra. And so, there are definitely a lot of exciting opportunities as I guess you would call gigging. But at the same time, I think it's also a necessary part of your studies, in fact, because when you're studying practicing in a practice room by yourself with no audience, that's not how you improve necessarily. Even if it's a gig, a so-called gig that you don't put such high priority to, you still have an audience that will react to whatever you're playing to them. And that's really important if you want to become a performer. You got to get used to that. Opportunity-wise, it's not always easy, but I think that's maybe one advantage of being in a music conservatory, because you make a lot of your musical connections there. Gigs might come out of those. Very often they do. And you also can come up with new ideas and programs and projects together with these colleagues and students together. So I think that's a very important thing whether you're studying at a university or in conservatories, to take advantage of that aspect of it, to create gigs if there are no gigs available, to come up with ideas. And we don't always realize that, because we think the most important part is just getting our lesson with the great master. And that's it. No, but a lot of it is what you do outside of that also.
I'd like to just restate what you just said, because I think that really relates to what you were talking about, the benefits of combining a liberal arts education and a musical education, that the job of an artist is to, yes, play the music, but also make the world, find the jobs, make the opportunities. And that kind of courage was a word you used before. And also the kind of playfulness that comes with mixing with other people and different kinds of learning. allows for that creativity to make one's own path and create gigs. David, I know that you have a commitment and have to step off pretty soon. I could turn one of the remaining questions to you, but before I do that, I just wonder, is there anything that you would like to leave us with before you have to step off to your next engagement?
Oh, there's so many thoughts going through my mind on all the things that we've discussed. I mean, there was one question that you asked earlier about studying music for people who are not going into music. I mean, it's important on so many levels. I mean, one, just what Trey referenced, like what it does for your mind and what it does for your soul. I mean, that's why my wife and I have our three children studying music. I mean, we're not expecting or pushing any of them to follow our path, but find that it does so much for one's sense of discipline, one's, I would even say like ability to learn. You know, it just kind of pushes your mental boundaries in those ways. And it doesn't have to be music, I think anything artistic, but just things in the unspoken realms kind of expand our capacity to speak in all ways. That's one thing. And the other thing is, I think for us musicians, people who are studying music and grow a deep appreciation for it and know what it takes to be a musician, even if they don't pursue it professionally themselves, these are the people who are like the truly key audience members we're going to have. I among the things I do is I conduct an orchestra full of amateur players, and these people have like a love and passion for music that's beyond that of many of my professional colleagues. And we had a Zoom reunion on the day our season finale would have been this year, because obviously we're all quarantined at home. And I told them, I said, nobody knows what concerts are going to look like next season or a year from now, but people like you are actually are going to be very pivotal in how we come out of this, because you have such a deep love for it that after working a 10-hour day, you come to rehearsal and listen to me talk. I mean, that's real dedication. So, you know, I think the most important people in our audience are not perhaps people who give millions of dollars, although of course we need them as well. But for the people who have like a true appreciation for it, having pursued it themselves to some degree. Um, so there are a lot of reasons to study music without it being your life calling, and those are just a couple thoughts that come to mind.
Thank you very much, David. David, I know you have to step off, so I think we're going to say goodbye to David. Trey and I will stay and continue the conversation for a little bit longer. But
Well,
thank you
It's a
very
pleasure
much,
being
David.
with you both. Again, do we have another engagement next Saturday? That would be great.
Yes. Thank you, David, so much.
Thank you. We'll touch base later.
Yes, for sure.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Wonderful to see you.
Bye-bye.
I'll turn the next question to you, Trey. Can you talk a little bit about homesickness? An attendee asked, do you feel homesick when you study overseas? And if so, how do you overcome that?
Oh, I think, music is the classical music world is so international now. It's almost rare at least people-wise, it's very rare you're surrounded just by one single group or people just from one country when you're in a conservatory or if you're in a performing situation. So in that sense, I feel like rather than thinking about being homesick, I feel like we're all sort of in the same boat together. You know, we're all in this kind of multinational ship, just sailing through and, you know, and getting to know a lot of new cultures. You know, I had never imagined that I would get to know people from so many different countries and also get to know their culture, especially through their music. So in a way, I would almost just embrace this opportunity that you have to learn about another culture, because you might not have that later in life, you know, because after your studies, just remember, you may very well have to go home, and then you won't have this chance to meet all these new people again. So this is the time to do it.
That's a great endorsement and very interesting. A panelist asked how difficult, a relevant question, how difficult is it to get in? And they were specifically asking about a dual degree, but I think the question could be even wider than that.
Winsome, you and I, we could discuss this also. You know, we just had our Harvard reunion, and I think we had been chatting with a couple other people before the reunion started about the type of applicants that Harvard gets nowadays, right? It's mind-boggling.
Yes. We were all laughing that if we had to apply today, we might not get in. Or at least I was saying that. I'm not sure if you were saying that. I'll speak for myself.
I think we all felt that way. We're like, oh my goodness, what are these people doing? Do they not sleep?
It's true. Young people today are pretty inspiring. So for sure, it's competitive. I can answer that question a little bit though, which is that there are many resources out there in the world, and some of the attendees were asking about Europe, some were asking about North America. And I just said North America, I'm Canadian. And so there's a whole world up in Canada as well. And so I would say that there's a place for everybody and the right place for everybody. And in terms of competitiveness, for sure, if you're just applying to those places that you know the names of, because they're famous and have been famous for hundreds of years, you're going for something that's incredibly competitive. But there are opportunities out there in lesser known universities, perhaps lesser known, especially in Asia. David mentioned some of them, so you can go back and look at some of those programs that he was mentioning. And there are many more. So I think that in terms of the difficulty of getting in, the first step is doing a lot of research and saying what's out there, because for sure there's the right spot for all of you. But it does take that legwork of finding out what's out there and casting a wide net. You shouldn't just be throwing one, I'm using a fishing analogy, you shouldn't just cast once, you should cast in many places, because it's through that the surprise gift of an acceptance at a place that you might not have considered your first choice might turn out to be something that affects your life in an incredibly positive way.
So in a sense, actually, Winsome, you were also an international student at Harvard.
Yes, I was and am, though I am American. I'm an American dual citizen. So although, because my dad was American, and so I grew up in Canada with the sense of an American identity a little bit, but for sure, I had never lived in the United States, and Canada and the United States are different countries with different cultures. From an outsider's perspective, they may seem similar, but they are, in fact, they have different histories. Which leads me to another question that came in from one of the attendees, which is to talk about the impact of music on history. I think that's a very big subject, but we could perhaps just discuss it for a moment, and then after that, perhaps we have time for one more question. Do you think that's about right, time-wise?
Yes, I think that's great. You know, it's so interesting because one of the reasons I like living here in Germany is, as a classical musician, it's very obviously connected the two. This was supposed to be the big Beethoven celebration year. The German government had budgeted tens of millions of euros to have all these events commemorating Beethoven because he was so important to the national identity and history. You know, Beethoven has been linked with people like Napoleon and to other kings and, you know, religious leaders and just powerful, really powerful people in his lifetime. And so it's sometimes you think, oh, what does music have to do with that? You know, music, we're just there to enjoy. It's pretty, it's nice, it makes me feel good. No, a lot of times it's very, you know, it moves people. You can really get people out of their seats, and not just in the concert hall, but in the streets. People listen to music and they get excited. And so, you know, that's, again, what we were saying before about music, the impact of music, it's so much more meaningful in everyone's lives than what we realize sometimes. And so but then of course, it's almost impossible at the same time to say what is the actual impact of music on history. You could say, okay, what if Beethoven had never written his Ninth Symphony? Well, then maybe the rest of music history would have been changed forever, because we may never have had other symphonies that had choirs. And we may not have had this theme that everyone in the world coalesces around when they hear it now, whether it's for major events or private events.
When the Berlin Wall fell, that's what they played. They played
Exactly.
the Ode to Joy.
Absolutely, and it's also the official anthem of the European Union. And you know, this is just, it's more like, you just have to ask yourself, what would life be like without a particular song or piece of music that you like?
Oh,
Rather than,
gosh.
you know, like,
Sort
my
of
goodness,
heartbreaking to think of that absence. Let's have one final, we'll wrap up the discussion. We've talked a lot about education, about travel, about the merits of meeting a whole different population of people with different life experiences. Have you any parting words for these young people and their parents who are listening to us today? Any words of advice or comfort or encouragement to them today?
Actually, I was thinking, you know, because we have this rare opportunity to meet up again here after our reunion last week, Winsome, that, you know, I'd like to maybe just think about, for both of us even, you know, from our experiences at Harvard, you know, there were so many moments for me where I got to do things that I never imagined I would do. And some of it was with music, right? And in a way, I think maybe if our listeners could take something away from that in a way where they think, okay, maybe that's what I want to experience when I choose a college, or that's what I want to learn when I go to university. You know, for me, I'll give you an example. Before Harvard, I just knew classical music because of Juilliard pre-college. And then one day in my junior year or something, I got a call, hey, would you like to play in the pit orchestra of the Stephen Sondheim charity concert? We're raising money to benefit a cancer hospital at the Deaconess, I believe. And I said, Stephen who? And so I went, and by this point, I wasn't practicing the cello. I didn't care, really. You know, I was busy sending out applications for internships. And so I went, and I heard the most glorious music and fun. That was one of the first times where I could play the cello and just sit back and go, wow, this is just fun. And I could look up at the stage, and the people are singing and dancing. I was like, it's hilarious. It's so relaxed. It's so over the top, but, you know, it's so different from what I'd always practiced and what I'd always, you know, learning at Juilliard. And, you know, I have to say, although that may not have been the moment where I decided to be a musician, but I would say that certainly added to this whole growing list of experiences that you were talking about, right? As artists that we need to draw upon for our own creations. So, you know, I think of things like that, experiences and moments like that. I don't know if you also have, I'm sure you must have at least.
I have many experiences of being surprised by something in life. I suppose my thought is as I've grown, I've learned that there are just many chapters in life and many different changes, and that each one should be experienced and treasured for what it is, including moments of pain, by the way, including moments of failure and hardship, because as a friend of mine wrote recently, he said the suffering, he was speaking about theater, but I think this applies to music and all arts. He said that the suffering of today is the art of tomorrow. And that we all need multiple experiences to lead a rich life. And as you were mentioning just now, what would the world be like without Beethoven's Ninth Symphony? In that same way, what would our life be like without the moments that have been difficult for us? We draw on those moments as a source of knowledge and experience and inspiration as we go forward. So that wasn't so much about playing Sondheim in the pit, but just to say that over the course of my life, the experiences that I've had, including the difficulties of university, have ended up shaping who I am. And maybe I'll talk just for 1 second to that subject. One of the things that really surprised me when I got to Harvard was they gave us a big book, the course catalog, about this big, full of all the courses you could take. And they sort of said, okay, choose. And to me, that was, choose what? How? How could I possibly? I mean, I was given a menu that was beyond my wildest imaginings and asked to pick my life out of it. And that was incredibly difficult. There was not a lot of guidance. I mean, I think you could find it if you wanted, but fundamentally, the choice was mine. And I would survive and thrive or potentially flounder, depending on how I lived out those choices. And that experience has served me very well, because fundamentally it's my life or it's your life. Nobody else can make those decisions for you. And that practice of taking responsibility is one that serves us well into adulthood, I think, no matter what our career. That, as my dad would often say, it's a solo flight. Though we all have friends and teams and teachers, that experience of developing our own muscles for decision-making and for success, it's great to start that early, and certainly an education in the liberal arts provides that, helps to provide that.
Absolutely.
I think, I know that after this, this talk today, you have other ones coming up. Would you like to tell us a little bit about what you have coming down the pike? And also, I'm going to say to the attendees that when we finish, there will be a survey coming up on your computer screen. It's a pop-up window. So we'd like to ask you please to answer that survey as soon as the webinar ends, so that Trey and the people at the Musicus Society can have your very important feedback about what you're looking for and what this experience today has done for you.
So yeah, in 2 weeks' time, 2 weeks from today, we will have Roberto Diaz, who is president of the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia, one of the most elite music conservatories in the world. So please join me in my conversation with Roberto Diaz then. And so Winsome, I have to thank you so much. Today has been such a pleasure. And I'm so glad that we got to reconnect yet again a week after our Harvard reunion. And hope we'll get to do this again sometime.
I very much hope so. Thank you so much, Trey. Thank you to the Musicus Society, and thank you to all of the attendees tuning in the late evening from your homes. So nice to be here with you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.